The crater in Kimi no Nawa is on some level quite sublime, isn't it? That to reference James Bergson, disaster is capturing the trauma of societies, of meta-narratives, to express the inexpressible. And it's in attempting to figure out that means of expression that we come into the works in the wake of 311. This is Thomas Lamarre, author of The Anime Machine, who I reached out to for a discussion about two major works that came out in 2016, Makoto Shinkai's Kimi no Nawa, and Anno Hideaki and Shinji Higuchi's Shin Godzilla, both of them looking at social, cultural, and technological debates on 311.
Yeah, I ended up writing an essay for a volume on radiation ecologies. And so I picked those two films to talk about. The editors had actually kind of asked me to deal with them, so it just worked out well because I felt like writing about them. That's why I started thinking more seriously about those two films together.
Lamarre was talking about what he said was happening in nuclear crises around the world, that it wasn't just limited to the detonation of bombs, and fukushima-daiichi is one of the many topics brought together. He says that while both talk about disaster, they tend to focus on it differently.
What interested me about the two films together is, first of all, Kimi no Nawa doesn't deal with radiation, right? It doesn't really deal with nuclear energy at all, which is interesting because it's dealing with the tragedy of 311 very obviously, and people read the film that way in Japan, so they understood that it was about something like an earthquake and a tsunami, and you see the imagery in the film, but it leaves out this other aspect very deliberately. So that in itself is interesting, like what kind of narrative is this trying to give us, where it's including part of what's happening in Fukushima, Japan, but not other parts. And then in Shin Godzilla, it's so obviously allegorical. So the director, Anno Hideaki, deliberately built in the idea that this new Godzilla was like that moment in Tokyo where everyone thought that radiation would spread to Tokyo. So he explicitly creates a monster who's a product of nuclear radiation in the Bay of Tokyo and posits that to try to deal with the events of 311.
Let's stop for a second there. Lamarre is referring to how Shinkai's storytelling seems to be informed by his early associations, not in terms of his shorts necessarily, but his background in visual novels, because Shinkai's storytelling has had some fairly consistent motifs, and therefore I'd argue that his experience in game storytelling still plays a fairly important role in understanding Kimi no Nawa. This all came before his work in animation, and thus would inform how he approaches telling a tale. When Taki crosses through time and bodies, for instance, it becomes a way to reset your attempt. The initial subjective shots from consciousness are reminiscent of the type of shots you'd see in visual novels. As the time and space increases in complexity, like levels, they become harder to deal with. And so, the discussion Lamarre is referring to are some critics arguing that Kimi no Nawa appropriates this sort of visual novel game logic to its storytelling. That's not just an animated film, but that it borrows a lot of visual novel elements in the form of an animated film.
There were those in Japan who said, because of its kind of video game logic, right, that you can work your way through this, that it was trivializing disaster. But I think for me, what's more interesting about the film is by dealing with the earthquake and tsunami, it rules out the Jieitai, or the SDF, that is Japan's self-defense forces, as heroes. Part of what the movie does is it's much closer in its logic to the Hanshin earthquake, where it was citizens groups that mobilized to save the community, and there was no governmental input. So you definitely see that. So citizens, in this case just a group of kids, are actually the ones who become responsible for saving the village.
The Jitai omission is quite interesting, even more so when we think of what they represent, the state, society, nation. Their relative lack of screen time brings to mind stories that tend to lack the middle ground, the in-between. I've talked about Shinkai stories before, the stories where the boy and the girl are in a relationship that affects a major catastrophe, with almost no middle ground. In that light, Kimi no Na wa is a 311 Shinkai, itself unsurprising considering that Shinkai was also responsible for one of the 3 big Shinkai works, Hoshi no Koi, or Voices of a Distant Star. But what are the implications of these roots? What's the importance in the omission of the Jietai in this Shinkai?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, I'm still a bit puzzled, like how either Shinkai or the committee working on the film decided to do it the way they did. But in the historical context, it's so clear that unlike Shin Godzilla, which is taking place around nuclear incident, the Jietai like just dominates the film. And that really happened in Japan. After the Hanshin earthquake, the Jietai realized that it just completely lost the PR campaign. And so by Fukushima, when that event happened, the Jietai were there instantly. So the Jietai really did dominate 311. But this was after this process of actually rethinking and restructuring how Jietai would respond to crisis. So for some reason, and it's interesting to speculate a bit why, Kimi no Na wa leaves out militarization. And it's true that Shinkai could go either way. Like some Shinkai, like if you think of a couple of the other entries, I mean the 2 most famous, those are super militarized. Military forces are actually in the film. It doesn't mean that they're endorsed, but true to Shinkai's work, he doesn't usually go super into military. But even compared to Hoshi no Koe and Kumo no Muko, there's far less military presence in Kimi no Na wa.
The lack of military presence is quite important when we think of these 3 big Shinkai works, Ufo no Natsu, Hoshi no Koi, and Saikano. The girl who fights is a synthesis of the body and the apparatus. In the case of Saikano, it becomes a literal fusing of the military and the girl.
I mean, I think of it kind of like very anime, but also like Saikano, like just does that to the hilt. Like, oh, there's this cute girl I'm interested in. It just happens to be a weapon of mass destruction. And it's strange because even in like Hoshi no Koe, you can see that there's this battle with aliens and militarism and communication systems are built together. But in the context of Kimi no Na wa, it's kind of surprising. It's all about, again, communications. At some level, it's all about cell phones and how you know, all kinds of media, but you don't really see any military presence.
Now we have a very important word in the equation, communication.
It struck me watching the film, what made it so powerful is that it plays all the time off this paradigm where Mitsuha, the girl, and the boy, Taki, can't touch each other physically. They always can only touch each other through some other kind of medium. For instance, they'll leave messages on each other's arms when they do their body swapping. Or even when they meet on the hill and that kind of scene near the end, right? They're almost touching, but they're not. They actually can't even see each other for a while. So it seems like the film is always playing off this idea that their relationship develops through a form of contact that's not physical, or mediated by something. It can be a hair ribbon, it could be the spit and the sake. It could be a cell phone message, a notebook message, something in the room, but they always have to have literally what's called in Japanese a baikai, like a go-between, a medium.
On the subject of a go-between, there seems to be a medium in the form of Shinkai's background. This was argued in Daisuke Watanabe's popular article, Why is Kimi no Na wa Being a Hit Such a Big Deal?, where he makes the connection between Shinkai's earlier Galgame history and how in 2016, at the time of Watanabe's article, Shinkai's official website did have his game background as part of his origins. To Watanabe, whereas Miyazaki came from the Toei animation lineage and Anno came from the tape-trading otaku, Shinkai represents a break from both through the Bishoujo games. In other words, Shinkai wasn't cut from the same cloth as greats like Hayao Miyazaki or Hideaki Anno. He represented a different wave of writers and directors, those who grew up and consumed anime as extensive, intertwined digital media with games. And this can also extend to the role that Kimi no Nawa plays in comparison to the rest of Shinkai's works. Whereas Shinkai's work tends to have somewhat ambivalent or sad endings, through game logic we can see Kimi no Nawa as a sort of good ending that Shinkai feels his audience deserves after the struggles of 311. And that's really interesting.
What I like in Watanabe's article, and I guess why so many people read it, is I think he really does pinpoint something crucial, that in the Sekai model, amnesia is so important. Right? There's always a moment of complete loss of contact, physical contact between the two characters, which he then says is like the moment of reset. And I agree, that's constantly happening in Kimi no Nawa. These two can't communicate face to face. They have no physical contact, don't even really know who each other are. So that communication can just be radically broken off very suddenly. And the film punctuates those moments, like a bell will ring or something will happen, and you know that this is reset moment. They will forget from this time what's happened previously. So I think he's right about that kind of narrative structure, that's super important. And maybe I'm expanding too much on it, that, he's saying that this is like girl games in that you always start the quest again to try to get to the so-called, what's called in Japanese, the true ending, or the good ending, I guess you would say in English. So Kimi no Nawa was playing like that. Like the film could end at any moment with a bad solution, because they're separated by time, they're separated by space, so it keeps kind of leveling up. At first you think they exist in the same time frame, but they don't. And you also find out they live at radically different ends of the country and so forth. So you have all of these obstacles to try to allow the game to continually reset itself to develop a loop where you can go back and replay the action. So I do think he's right that there's something game-like about that.
But those are ways in which we can think of Kimi no Nawa. If we had to discuss in essence what it would be about, what would you say?
I would say it's about contact without contact. It is sort of paradoxical because it's literally about how you communicate through media where you can never be assured the person at the other end is real. And I think that's what makes it popular across the world. Is it's one of the first films that actually gives you an experience of what social media is. So, I mean, even now, like we're talking on, Hangout, and I see these icons. I don't know you guys actually exist. I don't know that you, technically speaking, like Kimi no Nawa. So if the connection breaks, I try to find you again and I can't find you, then, like, where are you? It really plays on these daily social media behaviors we have and just intensifies them to the snapping point.
Now that brings us to the other 311 work.
For me, what the transition would be between the two films, right, is they're both kind of dealing with disaster. They're both evoking 311 or Fukushima, but they're also both really concerned with evacuation. So both of them have this kind of logistical imagination, like how the hell do you get people out of the disaster?
It's interesting you made the connection between the two through the lens of evacuation. In the context of evacuation, what differences did you think were particularly important?
It's kind of a good question. I don't know if I have the full answer to that, but it seemed to me what's interesting in Kimi no Nawa, again, it felt more like the Hanshin earthquake to me, in that even though this event is happened or is going to happen, that you kind of can have an evacuation. Like you can actually, get people out of the catastrophe. Whereas in Shin Godzilla, at the end, you're not ever actually out of the catastrophe. They create this sense that Gojira is frozen, right? So, and they say the radiation degrades, so no one's being irradiated. But a nuclear weapon is about to drop on Tokyo if and when Gojira reawakens. So, in some ways, it just seems that problem of evacuation is getting larger and larger and larger. You can't actually get out of the problem.
This seems to imply a somewhat nationalist bent. Shinzo Abe certainly praised Shin Godzilla for its supposedly nationalist message. But do you think it's nationalist?
Well, it's hard to say. Like, it's something that I sort of question about the film as well. I mean, the Gojira franchise, or at least the original, is really a war movie, and it was made instead of a war movie because they realized they couldn't get away with filming a war movie because it wouldn't play very well politically. So you get a lot of these war movie scenarios. You have cloudless skies, aerial views, you can always see the monster advancing, you have constant screens giving you this transparent information of tactical moves. You know, this is where the monster is, this is where we are, this is where we have to go. So it's almost like classic war games. And the scene that sticks with me is the very end of the movie, the hero, I forgot his name, he's looking out the skyline of Tokyo, and you see Gojira on the skyline looking as big as all the other buildings. He's kind of saying, okay, Japanese nationalism is a toy industry. Like, this is the Tokyo skyline, that we have our toys are bigger than anything else we have. And in fact, all of our economic and political relationships are going to revolve around a toy franchise, right, or a culture industry. So there's something about Anno's vision that is very weird enough that it's easy to read it ironically, or at least not as a pure kind of gung-ho, like I'm pro-Japanese or something.
This is somewhat reminiscent of the 1973 novel and later film Nihon Shinbotsu, in which Japan sinks under a series of cataclysmic disasters. Interestingly, Shinji Higuchi remade that exact film in 2006. Azuma Hiroki, during a Genron talk, talked about how that brings up questions of what exactly is preserved in the wake of a disaster. Do you think Kimi no Na wa and Shin Godzilla are preserving any sense of Japaneseness?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. It seems to me that Kimi no Na wa was, it's very easy for a film like that to travel because the way it evokes Japanese traditions is in a mode that's kind of inventive and not really grounded in concrete traditions per se, but it also fits nicely with just global cliches about Japan, right? About Shinto and media and all these other kinds of things. So in that sense, I feel like maybe Kimi no Na wa is not so interested in Japan, as a kind of historical space, but it's really interested in daily life of Tokyo. I think this is where the two films meet again, is that at the moment of 3/11 and immediately after, there was this sense of horror that in fact all of Tokyo was going to be irradiated and that it needs to be evacuated. And both those films love everyday Tokyo life to some extent, but Kimi no Na wa most of all. You get these loving, beautiful, luminous scenes of Tokyo. You have the girl who wants to live in Tokyo, and she ends up in Tokyo, and the village gets destroyed, but we still have Tokyo, right? If there's a vision of Japan, it's really about that kind of daily urban life. It seems to me in Shin Godzilla, it's also has a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen to Tokyo. And you constantly see these aerial views of the city and getting citizens in and out. And it's almost like, in that sense, Tokyo is different, though, because we're not really sure what daily life is. We don't have any images. Very rarely do even the heroes, the kind of government SDF, really even go into the streets. They're always in the air or looking at screens or something. So it's a harder film to figure out in that sense. And as I said, it might even be a bit crueler and more sadistic because ultimately Tokyo just ends up as sort of stuck between an American bomb and a Japanese explosion. Like it's stuck between a nuclear crisis and another kind of nuclear crisis. So I don't know, like in that film, can we actually find a livable place that we hang on to? These two directors, what was interesting about the reception of the films is since both of them are associated with otaku culture, everyone, like Azuma said, this is the end of otaku culture because now we have two films coming out of what used to be otaku culture that really don't feel at all like they're true to that lineage. At the same time, it seems that the differences between the films almost feel like generations of otaku because Anno is really the first generation of otaku, very interested in tokusatsu, science fiction films. So his sensibility about what that kind of popular culture in Japan is very different from Shinkai, who really is the next generation where everything is now Sekai-kei. It feels really different, and of course it has that Nichijou-kei inflection where just daily life is so foregrounded. I mean, in some ways, I think in both films, what emerges is Tokyo is saved in both of these films in some ways. Like, in Kimi no Nawa, it's a village that is destroyed and people can flee to Tokyo and begin their life. So everyday life in Tokyo isn't affected by the disaster at all. And then in the other film, it kind of just pauses at the moment where Tokyo is okay, even though it's on the verge of a new disaster. It feels like both films are really playing with that experience of Tokyo after 3/11. And it's hard to say, like, if they're trying to make us feel safe with daily life, right? If they're super conservative in that way, or whether we're supposed to feel these kinds of tensions underneath the surface. There's a lot at stake, right, in the way in which Tokyo can stand in for the center of the nation. Given that Tokyo is so close to Fukushima, it should make people nervous. Like, it's not that far removed from, the center of the radiation catastrophe.